Welcome back to Holloway Archives, where forgotten stories come to light and mysteries from the past find their voice. Before we dive into today's haunting tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these forgotten tales of human resilience, hidden truths, and the secrets that families carry through generations. Today's story begins with a single photograph that arrived at the Smithsonian Archives on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. What seemed like an ordinary Depression-era family portrait would soon unravel a mystery that had been buried for over 90 years, challenging everything we thought we knew about a mother's love, the nature of truth, and the lengths people will go to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The photograph showed what appeared to be a simple, tender scene. A woman in a plain cotton dress holding a boy of perhaps 8 years old. Their figures were framed against the flat horizon of rural Kansas, with a weathered wooden fence suggesting the hard times that gripped America in 1931. The woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothing spoke of hardship and perseverance, the quiet dignity of those who endured the Great Depression, with whatever strength they could muster. Dr. Margaret Chen, a senior archivist at the Smithsonian, with over 20 years of experience examining historical photographs, had seen thousands of such images cross her desk. She adjusted her reading glasses that Tuesday morning, expecting nothing more than routine documentation and cataloging. The photograph had been donated from the estate of Elenina Hartwell, along with dozens of other early 20th century keepsakes that told the story of an American family's journey through difficult times. But as Margaret reached for her magnifying glass to examine the image more closely, something made her hands slow. The woman's face radiated maternal warmth, her arms protective around the child, her expression softened by unmistakable love. The boy, however, was another matter entirely. Margaret leaned in, her breath catching as she studied his face through the magnifying lens. His gaze was fixed forward with an intensity that seemed far beyond his apparent years. While his mother held him in a natural, loving embrace, his hands remained stiff at his sides, rather than relaxed against her body. There was something in his eyes that made Margaret's chest tighten with unease. Where she expected to see the innocent wonder of childhood, she found something older, sharper, more deliberate. It was as if an adult mind was looking out through a child's face, and the effect was deeply unsettling. "That's odd," she whispered to herself, shifting the desk lamp so the light fell more directly across the photograph. The more she studied the boy's face, the more her unease grew. She had examined thousands of family photographs from this era, and children's expressions were as familiar to her as her own reflection. But this child's gaze held something she had never encountered before, a knowledge that seemed to transcend his physical age, a weight in his eyes that spoke of experiences no 8-year-old should possess. Margaret made a careful note in her research log that evening. Unusual family photograph from Hartwell Estate. Boy's expressions suggest possible psychological trauma or developmental anomalies. Recommend further investigation into family history and circumstances surrounding the image. She could not have known then that this single photograph would lead her down a path that would challenge everything she believed about the nature of childhood, illness, and the extraordinary compassion that some people show in the face of the inexplicable. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving along the winding roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, toward the sprawling Victorian home that had belonged to Elenina Hartwell. The elderly woman had died at 97, leaving behind a meticulously kept estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield for living quietly and purposefully. Local residents described her as a woman who kept to herself but was unfailingly kind to her neighbors, particularly children, though she had never married or had children of her own. At the door, Margaret was greeted by Elenina's great-niece, Sarah Morrison, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and brown hair, threaded with gray, tied back neatly. Sarah was a librarian from Philadelphia, who had taken leave from her position to settle her great-aunt's affairs. The family connection ran deep, and Sarah had grown up hearing stories about Aunt Elenina's dedication to preserving their family history. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Elenina's collection," Sarah said warmly as she led Margaret inside. The house felt preserved in time, a museum of family memory maintained with loving care. Hardwood floors groaned softly underfoot as they passed walls hung with portraits spanning generations. each photograph mounted and labeled in Elenina's careful handwriting. She never married, never had children. Sarah explained as they walked through the halls, but she devoted her entire adult life to preserving our family story. She used to say that photographs were windows into souls, that they revealed truths people might prefer to keep hidden. She spent decades researching our genealogy, tracking down distant relatives, and collecting every photograph, letter, and document she could find. The study where Elenina had done her research was a small, book-lined room with a broad oak desk, scattered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and research notes written in her distinctive script. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across pages of family trees and correspondence that stretched back generations. Sarah lifted a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said, passing it over with reverent care. "Aunt Elenina's notes on that 1931 photograph you mentioned." She spent years trying to understand it, becoming almost obsessed with uncovering the truth behind that image. Margaret opened the journal gently, scanning the elegant handwriting that filled page after page. Elenina's research was meticulous, cross-referencing dates, locations, and family connections with the precision of a professional historian. One entry, dated just 2 years before Elenina's death, caught Margaret's eye. "The boy in mother's arms, why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never understood? The truth about Thomas must be somewhere in these photographs, in these records. I feel it in my bones that our family has been keeping a secret, and that secret has to do with this child who appears in our family album but disappears from our family memory." Margaret looked up from the journal. "Thomas?" Sarah's expression clouded, and she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's the thing that made this mystery so compelling to Aunt Elenina. And so frustrating. We're not entirely sure who Thomas was, or even if that was his real name. The family stories about him are contradictory, confusing, and sometimes completely at odds with each other." Later that afternoon, over coffee in the kitchen, the two women spread photographs across the worn wooden table. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows over the images that seemed to bring the past to life. Sarah rested her hands on the table and took a deep breath before continuing her explanation. "What I'm about to tell you may sound strange, but I spent months going through Aunt Elenina's research, and I've come to understand why this mystery consumed her final years. Growing up, I overheard whispers about a boy named Thomas, who lived with my great-great-grandmother, Ruth Hartwell, in the early 1930s. But the stories never matched up, and the more I learned, the more confusing it became." Sarah reached for the original photograph, studying the boy's unsettling expression. Some family members swore he was Ruth's son, who died young of influenza during the particularly harsh winter of 1931. Others insisted he wasn't Ruth's child at all, but just a boy she cared for temporarily, while his own family faced hard times during the Depression. And still others claimed that Thomas never existed, that the boy in this photograph was someone else entirely, or that the stories had been confused over the decades. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the boy's face, that peculiar, unsettling expression frozen forever in silver and shadow. "What did Elenina believe? That's what makes this so intriguing," Sarah replied, reaching into a manila envelope and drawing out another photograph. "Aunt Elenina found this image last year while sorting through papers in the attic. It changed everything she thought she knew about our family history." The second photograph, also clearly from 1931, but taken months later judging by the heavier clothing and the different quality of light, showed the same woman, Ruth Hartwell, standing alone before the same farmhouse. But this Ruth looked different from the woman in the first photograph. She appeared weary, almost hollow, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she were trying to hold herself together through sheer willpower. Her eyes, which had been warm and loving in the first image, now seemed haunted by something she couldn't forget. Most striking of all, the boy was gone. Ruth stood alone in the frame, the empty space around her somehow more unsettling than if she had simply been photographed by herself from the beginning. "Turn it over," Sarah urged quietly. Margaret did so with care, and on the back, in faded ink that had been carefully preserved, someone had written, "After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." A cold ripple traced Margaret's spine as she read the words again. The handwriting appeared to be Ruth's, though it was shaky, as if written under emotional duress. The phrasing was haunting. Not "after Thomas died" or "after we lost Thomas," but "after Thomas left us." and the plea for divine forgiveness suggested something more complex than simple grief over a child's death. "Left?" Margaret said aloud. "But your relative said he died of influenza." "Exactly," Sarah said, her voice taking on a darker tone. That's when Aunt Elena realized our family had been hiding something for nearly a century. The official family story was that Ruth had taken in a distant relative's child during hard times, and that the boy had tragically died of illness. But this inscription suggested something entirely different. That Thomas had left, not died, and that whatever happened involved something that required God's forgiveness. Margaret opened her notebook, her mind racing with questions. Did Elenina discover anything else that might explain the discrepancy? Sarah hesitated, then retrieved a third photograph from the envelope. She found this hidden behind the frame of an old mirror in the attic. It's dated just 2 weeks before the first photograph we looked at. This image showed Ruth Hartwell standing in the same location, with the same farmhouse in the background, but with a completely different boy. This child had lighter hair, bright eyes that sparkled with life, and a warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up his entire face. The resemblance between Ruth and this boy was unmistakable. The same facial structure, the same gentle expression, the same natural ease in each other's presence. This, Sarah said quietly, was Ruth's real son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this picture was taken. According to family records, he was Ruth's only child, born in 1923, and he had always been frail and sickly. Margaret studied the 3 photographs side by side, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture that was both clearer and more mysterious than before. So Ruth lost her biological son James to illness, and then somehow this other boy, Thomas, came to live with her? That's what Aunt Elenina concluded. Sarah nodded. But who was Thomas? Where did he come from? And what happened to him that required Ruth to ask for God's forgiveness? The following morning, Margaret returned to Washington, D.C. with copies of all 3 photographs and Elenina's meticulous research notes. Her mind churned with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve as she learned more about the Hartwell family history. The very next day, she contacted Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who specialized in photographic authentication and historical document analysis at Georgetown University. "I need you to examine these very carefully," she told him as they met in his laboratory, a high-tech facility equipped with digital microscopes and computer analysis systems that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. "I want to know everything: the paper composition, the chemical processes used, any signs of tampering or manipulation, anything that might tell us more about when and how these images were created." James Patterson was a methodical researcher in his mid-50s who had helped unravel more than one historical mystery during his career. He had a reputation for being able to coax secrets from photographs that their creators never intended to reveal. Placing the first photograph, Ruth with the dark-haired boy, under a high-powered digital microscope, he studied it in silence for several minutes before murmuring, "Interesting." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you see?" "The paper and chemicals are definitely consistent with 1931 photography," he said, adjusting the focus. "So the photograph itself is authentic to that time period. But there's something unusual about the image quality that caught my attention." "What kind of unusual?" James pointed at the magnified image on his monitor. "Here, around the boy's face, the grain structure is slightly different from the rest of the photograph. It's subtle. Someone who wasn't looking for it would never notice, but it suggests this part of the image may have been subjected to additional processing or exposure during development." He moved on to the second photograph, showing Ruth alone after Thomas had left. "No irregularities here," he reported after careful examination. "This is a straightforward image, completely typical of amateur photography from that era." Then he examined a third photograph, showing Ruth with her biological son James, and after a few moments his voice sharpened with excitement. "Margaret, you need to see this. This is where it gets really interesting." On his computer screen, he overlaid the first and third photographs, adjusting for angle and lighting to match the perspectives as closely as possible. "Look at the background elements," he said, highlighting various features. "The fence posts, the shadows they cast, the way the light falls on the farmhouse. They're nearly identical between these 2 images." Margaret studied the overlay, beginning to see what James had discovered. "You're saying these were taken closer together in time than the dates suggest?" "Much closer. But here's the really compelling evidence." He zoomed in on Ruth's clothing in both photographs. "See this small tear near her left shoulder in the first image? It's in the exact same place in the third photograph." And here, this scuff mark on her shoe, the way her dress falls, even the way her hair catches the light. These pictures were taken much closer together in time than the family records indicate. Margaret's pulse quickened. How close are we talking? Same day, James said definitively, possibly within hours of each other. Someone went to considerable trouble to make it appear that these photographs were taken weeks or months apart, but the physical evidence tells a different story. Armed with this revelation, Margaret knew she needed to travel to the source, Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwell family had lived in 1931. The small farming town, now home to fewer than 2,000 residents, still maintained Depression-era records in its modest town hall, a brick building that had served the community for over a century. Mary Kowalski, the town clerk, was a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a memory that seemed to contain decades of local history. Her grandfather had been the town's doctor in the 1930s, and she had grown up hearing stories about the families he had served during those difficult times. Ruth Hartwell? Mary mused, pulling out dust-covered record books that hadn't been consulted in years. Oh yes, I remember the stories about her. My grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Sweet boy, but frail from birth. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1931, and it broke poor Ruth's heart. She never got over losing that child. Margaret slid the 3 photographs across the counter, watching Mary's face carefully as she examined them. The older woman studied them for a long moment, her expression shifting from recognition to confusion. "This is definitely Ruth," Mary said, tapping the image of the woman in the first photograph. Her finger moved to the 3rd photograph, showing Ruth with James. "And this boy, yes, he has the Hartwell look. Same sandy hair, same gentle expression as his father. I can see the family resemblance clear as day." But when Mary's gaze shifted to the first photograph, the image of Ruth with the dark-haired boy that had started Margaret's entire investigation, her brow furrowed in confusion. "This child, though, I don't recognize him at all. And I knew every family in this area during the Depression. We all looked after one another's children, especially during the hard times. If there had been a boy living with Ruth, even temporarily, I would have known about it." Mary studied the boy's face more closely, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There's something about his eyes that's unsettling, almost as if he's much older than he appears. Children didn't look like that back then, or maybe they did, but we didn't talk about it." She crossed to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder marked 1931, Birth and Death Records. Running her finger down a neatly handwritten list, she found what she was looking for. James Hartwell died February 15, 1931. Poor little thing was only 8 years old. Mary looked up at Margaret with growing puzzlement. "But here's the strange part, and why your photographs are so confusing. According to our official records, after James died, Ruth lived alone on that farm until she moved to Pennsylvania later that year to live with relatives. There's no record of any other child living with her, no adoption papers, no temporary custody arrangements, no mention of caring for anyone else's children. Nothing." A chill prickled the back of Margaret's neck. The official records contradicted not only the family stories, but also the photographic evidence. Is there anyone else in town who might remember those times? Mary considered the question carefully. Frank Morrison is 94 years old now, lives at the assisted living facility on Elm Street. His family's farm bordered the Hartwell place back then, and if anyone would recall a strange boy living with Ruth, it would be Frank. His mind is still sharp, and he loves talking about the old days. The Millfield Assisted Living Center was a modest but well-kept facility, its wide windows overlooking carefully tended gardens where residents could sit and remember quieter times. Frank Morrison sat in a wheelchair by one such window, his mind still remarkably clear despite his advanced age. When Margaret placed the photograph of Ruth with the dark-haired boy in his weathered hands, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Dear God," he whispered, his hands beginning to tremble as he stared at the image. "I never thought I'd see that child's face again." Margaret drew her chair closer, her heart pounding with anticipation. "You remember him?" Frank nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "Thomas. That's what Ruth called him, though I always doubted it was his real name. He appeared at her farm not long after James died. A week, maybe 2. Ruth was nearly undone with grief over losing her boy, and then suddenly, there he was." "Where did he come from?" Margaret asked gently. "That's just it. No one knew. Ruth claimed she was caring for him while his family faced hard times, said they were distant relatives who couldn't manage during the Depression, But none of us had ever heard of these relatives, and Ruth was always vague about the details when anyone asked. Frank's eyes grew distant as he remembered. There was something wrong about that boy, though I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were too knowing, too adult. He seemed to understand things about people that he shouldn't have been able to understand. Private matters about neighbors, events that had happened before he ever arrived in Millfield. The old man's voice dropped even lower. Animals didn't like him. Our family dog, who was friendly with everyone, would whimper and hide whenever that boy came around. Even Ruth's old milk cow would grow restless and agitated when he came near. Animals sense things that people sometimes miss. Margaret slid the second photograph across to Frank, the image of Ruth standing alone. What happened to him? Frank's face shadowed with what looked like a mixture of relief and lingering fear. He vanished one night in late summer 1931. Just disappeared without a word or a trace. Ruth never spoke of it, never explained where he had gone or why. But the next morning, she looked different. Relieved, maybe, but also haunted, like someone who had been through something terrible. Was he reported missing to the authorities? That's the strangest part of the whole situation, Frank said, leaning back in his chair. Nobody cared. It was as if the entire town had agreed to forget he'd ever been here. Even Ruth acted as though he'd never existed. When people asked about him in the weeks that followed, she would just change the subject, or pretend she didn't know what they were talking about. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. I'll tell you something I've never told another soul in all these years. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was coming home late from helping a neighbor with his harvest. I passed Ruth's farm around midnight, and I saw her in the yard behind the barn. She was digging deep, working by lantern light. I watched her for a few minutes, hidden by the darkness, and she was working like a woman possessed, like someone who had to finish a terrible job before dawn. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Did you ever find out what she was burying? Frank shook his head. I never asked, and she never said, but I always wondered. And now, seeing that photograph again, after all these years, I can't help but think that, whatever happened to Thomas, Ruth knew about it. Maybe she even caused it, though I can't imagine that gentle woman hurting anyone, even a strange child like that. That evening, Margaret phoned Sarah Morrison from her hotel room. Within hours, Sarah was on a plane to Kansas, determined to help solve the mystery that had consumed her great-aunt's final years. Together, they drove out to find the old Hartwell farm, following directions from local residents who remember the property from their childhood. The farm, abandoned since the 1950s, still stood on land now owned by a local farming corporation. The current owner, Robert Jensen, was a plain-spoken man in his 60s who had grown up hearing tales of the cursed Hartwell place. Not only did he give Margaret and Sarah permission to search the property, but he also offered to lend them ground-penetrating radar equipment he used for checking irrigation lines and underground utilities. The farmhouse lay in ruins, its roof caved in, and siding stripped bare by decades of harsh Kansas weather. Yet the stone foundation remained solid, and the barn Frank had described still stood, its red paint long faded to a rusty brown that matched the Kansas clay. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning pacing the overgrown property, photographs in hand, matching the long-forgotten angles of the past to the silent, skeletal remains of the present. Despite decades of decay and the changes wrought by time and weather, they found it the slight rise in the earth where Ruth had once stood with both boys, the exact vantage point that framed the farmhouse perfectly in the background of those haunting photographs. Frank said she was digging behind the barn. Margaret reminded Sarah as they approached the weathered structure. The ground there was tangled with tall grass and weeds that had grown wild for decades, but the radar would be able to see what their eyes could not. Robert Jensen arrived at midday, wheeling out a machine that looked like an oversized lawnmower attached to a computer monitor. This thing can show us what's buried up to about 10 feet down, he explained as he fired up the equipment. We use it all the time to locate old septic systems and water lines on properties like this. Margaret and Sarah hovered close, watching the grainy lines shift and change on the display screen as Robert slowly guided the device across the overgrown soil. For nearly an hour, they found nothing but the expected underground debris, old fence posts, chunks of concrete, the detritus of a working farm. Then Robert suddenly halted the machine. There, he said, pointing at the monitor. Something's definitely buried here, about 4 feet down. It's roughly rectangular, and it's definitely not natural. Margaret's pulse quickened. How big? Robert studied the display, his expression growing uncomfortable. About the size of a large suitcase, or... He glanced up at the two women, clearly uneasy. Could be a small casket. Sarah's hand tightened around Margaret's arm. "You don't think?" "There's only one way to know for certain," Margaret said. Though her voice was steady, her mind was racing. "We need to call the sheriff. If there's any chance these are human remains, this has to be handled properly by law enforcement." They waited in the growing afternoon heat, the wind sweeping through the abandoned farm, whistling through the shattered windows of the old farmhouse, and stirring the tall grass in long, hypnotic waves. In that sound, Margaret thought, just for a moment, she heard something else, the faint echo of a child's voice. Not laughter, but something low and cold that made her skin crawl. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within the hour, accompanied by the county coroner and a forensic team from the state police. The veteran officer had seen his share of strange cases during his 20-year career, but never the reopening of a potential crime scene that was nearly a century old. "We need to proceed with extreme care," said Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist who led the team. "If these are human remains, they'll be extremely delicate after all this time. And if this is connected to a crime, every fragment of evidence could be crucial. The excavation was painstakingly slow and methodical." Once the team reached the depth indicated by the radar, they abandoned shovels in favor of small trowels and brushes, working with the delicate precision of archaeologists uncovering ancient artifacts. 2 hours later, a technician called out, "I've got something here." Dr. Chen crouched beside the excavation, sweeping away soil with a soft brush until the corner of something wooden began to emerge. It was clearly handmade, a small, crude box with uneven joints that spoke of hasty, unskilled construction. This wasn't made by a professional carpenter, Dr. Chen noted as more of the structure became visible. Someone built this quickly, probably under considerable pressure or emotional duress. Sheriff Martinez carefully photographed every angle as they slowly lifted the makeshift coffin from its decades-long resting place. The wood was surprisingly well preserved, protected by the Kansas clay that had served as a natural seal. The latch, though corroded, still held the box closed. The sheriff addressed the small circle of onlookers who had gathered around the excavation site. "If these are human remains, we may be looking at evidence of a 1931 crime. We follow protocol from here on out." "Doctor." Chen opened the latch with infinite care and peeled back what had once been white cloth, now stained and brittle with age. Within the makeshift coffin lay a small human skeleton, but as the forensic anthropologist began her preliminary examination, her professional composure gave way to frowning confusion. "This is highly unusual," she said, studying the bones with a magnifying glass. "The skeletal proportions don't match what I would expect. The skull suggests someone much older than the body's overall size would indicate." Even Margaret and Sarah, watching from a respectful distance, could see what had caught Dr. Chen's attention. The skeleton was small, clearly that of a child, but certain features seemed disproportionate. The bone density appeared higher than normal for someone so young, and most striking of all, the skull contained a full set of adult teeth, something that should have been impossible in a child of 8 or 9 years old. While the forensic team carefully documented their findings, Margaret's phone rang. It was James Patterson calling from Georgetown University, and his voice was sharp with excitement and discovery. "Margaret, I think I know what you found out there. Based on your description of the skeletal remains and everything you've told me about this case, I believe you may be dealing with a condition called progeria." Margaret frowned, unfamiliar with the term. "Progeria? It's an extremely rare genetic disorder," James explained. "Children with progeria age rapidly, taking on many of the physical characteristics of elderly adults, while still chronologically very young. In 1931, the condition was virtually unknown to medical science. Families dealing with it would have had no understanding of what they were seeing." Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. What kind of symptoms would a child with this condition exhibit? Physically, they would appear much older than their actual age. Aged skin, adult teeth erupting early, bones that develop more like those of an adult. But here's the crucial part for your investigation. Mentally and emotionally, they would possess the full intellectual capacity of their chronological age, or sometimes even beyond. The contrast between their aged physical appearance and their young minds could be deeply unsettling to people who didn't understand the condition. Margaret's mind raced as she considered the implications. James, you mentioned this was unknown in 1931. Would there be any medical records from that time period? That's why I'm calling. After our conversation yesterday, I did some research into early medical literature on progeria. I found a fascinating case study from 1930, a boy named Timothy Walsh, who was documented at a state facility in Nebraska. The records describe him as having advanced progeria with severe behavioral complications that made him difficult to manage in any institutional setting. Behavioral complications? According to the medical notes I found, Timothy possessed what the doctors called the mind and emotional sophistication of an adult trapped in the failing body of a child. The contrast was deeply unsettling to everyone who encountered him. His physically deteriorated appearance, combined with an adult's understanding of psychology and human nature, allowed him to read and manipulate the emotions of those around him with disturbing skill. James paused before continuing. In the 1930s, when understanding of psychology was limited and conditions like progeria were completely unknown, such a combination would have seemed almost supernatural. The records describe Timothy as calculating and manipulative, capable of exploiting adult emotions and fears in ways that unnerved everyone he encountered. What happened to him? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. He disappeared from the Nebraska facility in late 1930. The records indicate he simply vanished one night, and despite searches by local authorities, he was never found. The staff at the facility actually seemed relieved that he was gone, which tells you something about how disturbing his presence had become. Margaret felt the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. James, can you send me those medical files? I think Timothy Walsh and the boy Ruth Hartwell called Thomas are the same person. After ending the call, Margaret relayed James's discovery to Sarah, Sheriff Martinez, and Dr. Chen. The revelation transformed their understanding of everything they had uncovered. Ruth Hartwell had not been harboring some supernatural being or dealing with an ordinary orphan child. She had taken in a desperately ill boy whose rare medical condition would not be properly understood or treatable for decades to come. So Thomas, or Timothy, died from his illness while staying with Ruth? Sarah asked. It seems likely, Margaret replied. She probably took him in out of compassion when he showed up at her farm, possibly after escaping from or being released from the Nebraska facility. But when he died, she must have panicked. Dr. Chen, who had been listening to their conversation while continuing to examine the remains, looked up from her work. In 1931, if authorities had found a child's body with these easy kinds of unusual physical characteristics and no understanding of progeria existed, they might have suspected foul play, or even something supernatural. An uneducated rural community might have accused Ruth of terrible things. Margaret nodded, the full tragedy of the situation becoming clear. She buried him in secret not to hide cruelty, but to protect herself, and possibly to give him the dignity of a burial he might never have received otherwise. In her time, with the limited medical knowledge available, Timothy's condition would have been seen as something frightening and unnatural. Sheriff Martinez, who had been quietly listening to their discussion, spoke up. So we're looking at a mercy burial, not a murder. A woman trying to do right by a sick child and protect herself at the same time. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood once again in Elenina Hartwell's study, beside Sarah. Morrison. They had spent days combing through medical reports, town records, and Elenina's careful research notes, piecing together the complete truth behind the mysterious 1931 photograph. What had begun with a single unsettling image had revealed itself as a story of quiet compassion, tragic circumstances, and the extraordinary lengths one woman had gone to protect both herself and a suffering child. The forensic findings had confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child of approximately 10 years in chronological age, but with bones and teeth that belonged to someone much older. Limited DNA testing had matched samples from the Walsh family in Nebraska, confirming that Thomas had indeed been Timothy Walsh, the boy who had disappeared from the state facility. Elenina suspected something like this, Sarah said, reading from her great-aunt's final journal entry. Listen to what she wrote just months before she died. I believe Ruth saved that poor boy from a lifetime of institutional horror. When his suffering finally ended, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great personal risk. The secret she carried wasn't one of shame, but of love. Margaret had arranged for Timothy to be reinterred in Millfield Cemetery, beneath a proper headstone that had been approved by both the Walsh descendants and the Hartwell family. The inscription read simply, Timothy Walsh, 1920 to 1931. A child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace. The meaning of the original 1931 photograph was now crystal clear. Ruth's embrace had been genuine, her maternal affection real and deeply felt. Timothy's unsettling gaze was not born of malice or supernatural knowledge, but of pain, the haunted look of a child far too aware of his own physical decline and mortality, trapped in a body that was betraying him while his mind remained sharp and understanding. Ruth was a hero, Margaret thought as she studied the photograph one final time before placing it in an archival sleeve. In a time and place when most people would have recoiled in fear from Timothy's condition, she saw past his frightening appearance to the suffering child beneath. She gave him comfort in his final months, in dignity and death, carrying the weight of that secret for the rest of her life. The photograph would take its place in the Smithsonian collection, but not as an unsolved mystery. Instead, it would stand as a testament to human compassion in the face of the incomprehensible, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening appearances hide the deepest suffering. As Margaret prepared to leave Pennsylvania for the final time, Sarah handed her one last item from Elenina's collection. A letter that had been tucked away in the back of the research journal, written in Ruth Hartwell's own hand and dated 1932, nearly a year after Timothy's death. My dear sister, the letter began, addressed to Ruth's sister in Pennsylvania. I know you have wondered why I left Kansas so suddenly, why I could never speak of those final months on the farm. I write this knowing I may never have the courage to send it, but I need to put these words somewhere, if only to quiet my own troubled heart. A boy came to me in my darkest hour, when grief over losing James had nearly broken me completely. He was strange, frightening even, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world and a face that looked far older than his years. The townspeople whispered about him, crossed themselves when they saw him, muttered about curses and unnatural things. But I saw something they could not see. I saw a child who was dying, slowly and painfully, with no one to comfort him in his final days. I cannot explain why I felt compelled to care for him. Perhaps it was because I had just lost my own boy, and my empty arms ached to hold a child again. Perhaps it was because I recognized, in his eyes, the same fear and confusion I had seen in James's face during his final illness. Or perhaps it was simply because no one else would. The boy, he told me his name was Timothy, though I called him Thomas to protect his privacy, stayed with me through the summer of 1931. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried wisdom and sadness far beyond his apparent age. He knew things about life, about death, about the cruelty of fate that no child should ever have to understand. Sometimes I would find him staring out at the sunset with tears streaming down his weathered face, and I knew he was contemplating his own mortality in a way that would have been heartbreaking in anyone, but was especially tragic in one so young. He died peacefully in September, simply falling asleep one night and never waking up. His poor body, which had been fighting a battle it could never win, finally found rest. I buried him behind the barn with my own hands, said prayers over his grave, and marked the spot with a simple wooden cross that I carved myself. I could not bear the thought of him being taken away to some distant cemetery, alone and unmourned. He deserved to rest somewhere he had known kindness, even if only briefly. I have never regretted taking him in, though I know others might judge my decision harshly. In those few months I learned that compassion is not about understanding what we encounter, but about responding with love even when we are afraid. Timothy taught me that sometimes the most frightening exteriors hide the gentlest souls, and that our duty as human beings is to look beyond appearances to the suffering beneath. I carry his memory with me always, along with the memory of my dear James. 2 boys, so different in appearance and circumstance, but both deserving of love, and both taken far too soon. If God judges me for the choices I made, I pray He will judge me with mercy, for everything I did came from a desire to ease suffering, not cause it. I hope someday our family will understand. Until then, I keep these secrets close to my heart where they belong. Your loving sister, Ruth. As Margaret read the letter aloud, tears gathered in Sarah's eyes. She never sent it, Sarah whispered. Aunt Elenina found it sealed in an envelope, never mailed. Ruth carried this burden alone for the rest of her life. Margaret carefully folded the letter and placed it with the other documents. But she didn't carry it in vain. Her compassion gave Timothy Walsh something he probably never had before: a home where he was accepted, cared for, and loved despite his frightening appearance. In his final months, he experienced the maternal love that his condition had likely denied him throughout his short life. The drive back to Washington gave Margaret time to reflect on everything she had discovered. The mystery of the unsettling 1931 photograph had been solved, but the solution revealed something far more profound than she had expected. It wasn't a story about supernatural occurrences or family secrets born of shame. It was a story about the extraordinary capacity for human kindness in the face of fear and misunderstanding. In 1931, medical science had no name for Timothy Walsh's condition, no treatment to offer, no framework for understanding how a child could possess an adult's awareness while trapped in a body that was rapidly aging and failing. Ruth Hartwell had no medical training, no support system, no guidance for how to care for such a child. What she had was an open heart and the courage to act on her compassion despite her fear and the judgment of her community. The photograph that had started Margaret's investigation now told a completely different story. Timothy's intense, unsettling gaze was not the look of something sinister or supernatural, but the expression of a child who understood his own mortality with heartbreaking clarity. Ruth's protective embrace was not the fearful gesture of someone harboring a dark secret, but the loving response of a woman who had chosen to see past appearances to the suffering child beneath. Margaret thought about the lessons hidden within this nearly century-old mystery. How many times do we judge others based on appearances that we don't understand? How often do we allow fear of the unknown to prevent us from showing compassion to those who need it most? Ruth Hartwell's story reminded her that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the quiet ones. The decision to love when it would be easier to turn away. The choice to show mercy when others show only fear. As Margaret reached the outskirts of Washington, D.C., her phone rang. It was Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist who had examined Timothy's remains. "Margaret, I wanted to update you on our final analysis," Dr. Chen said. "The skeletal examination confirmed everything we suspected about progeria, but we also discovered something else that I thought you should know." "What did you find?" "Evidence of extensive medical intervention. Old fractures that had been carefully set and healed. Signs of ongoing medical care that would have been quite advanced for 1931. This boy received significant medical attention throughout his life, probably from the state facility where he lived before coming to Ruth Hartwell." Margaret absorbed this information, understanding its implications. So he wasn't just abandoned or neglected. Someone had been trying to help him medically. Exactly. And there's one more thing. Based on the bone development and other markers, Timothy probably had a higher than average intelligence. Children with progeria often do. So not only was he dealing with a rare, frightening physical condition, but he was intellectually capable of understanding exactly what was happening to him. The psychological burden must have been enormous. This final piece of information made Ruth's compassion even more remarkable. She had taken in a child who was not only physically disturbing to look at, but who possessed the intellectual capacity to understand his own tragic situation completely. Timothy Walsh had been trapped in a nightmare of physical deterioration and premature awareness, and Ruth Hartwell had been the one person willing to offer him comfort and dignity in his final months. Margaret arrived at the Smithsonian as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the museum's corridors. She made her way to her office, where the original 1931 photograph waited on her desk, still in its archival sleeve. Looking at it now, she no longer felt the unease that had first drawn her into this investigation. Instead, she saw a document of profound human connection, evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, people are capable of extraordinary kindness. The boy's face no longer unsettled her. Now she saw what Ruth had seen from the beginning, not an oddity or something to be feared, but a child worthy of love and remembrance. Timothy Walsh had lived only 11 years, but in those final months with Ruth Hartwell, he had experienced something precious. Unconditional acceptance from someone who chose to see his humanity rather than his illness. Margaret began writing her final report on the case. But she knew the true value of this investigation wasn't in the academic analysis or the historical documentation. The real treasure was a reminder that compassion often requires courage, that love sometimes demands that we look beyond our fears and preconceptions to see the person beneath the surface. Ruth Hartwell had faced a choice that most people never encounter. The opportunity to show mercy to someone whose appearance frightened her, whose presence made her community uncomfortable, whose very existence challenged the boundaries of what was considered normal or acceptable. She had chosen love over fear, compassion over convenience, and in doing so, she had given Timothy Walsh something invaluable: a peaceful death surrounded by caring rather than isolation and fear. The photograph would indeed take its place in the Smithsonian collection, accompanied by the full story of its subjects. Visitors would learn about Timothy Walsh's rare condition, Ruth Hartwell's extraordinary compassion, and the lengths that Elenina Hartwell had gone to in order to uncover the truth about her family's history. But the deeper lesson of the image would be available to anyone willing to look beyond the surface. Sometimes what appears frightening is simply what we don't yet understand. Sometimes the most important acts of heroism happen in quiet moments, when no one is watching, when there's no recognition or reward for doing the right thing. And sometimes the most profound human connections occur between people who seem to have nothing in common, except their shared need for understanding and acceptance. As Margaret sealed the photograph in its archival housing for the final time, she reflected on how this investigation had changed her own perspective. She had begun with a professional curiosity about an unusual historical image, but she was ending with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and beauty of human nature. Ruth Hartwell's story reminded her that we all have the capacity to choose compassion over fear, love over judgment, understanding over ignorance. The mystery of the 1931 photograph was solved, but its message would endure. In the archives of the Smithsonian, future researchers and visitors would encounter not just a historical curiosity, but a testament to the best of human nature, a reminder that in a world that often seems dark and frightening, there are still people willing to choose light, still individuals courageous enough to love without condition, still hearts open enough to see past surface differences to the common humanity beneath. Timothy Walsh had died nearly 90 years ago, but through Margaret's investigation and the preservation of his story, his brief life had taken on new meaning. He was no longer just a victim of a rare and cruel disease, but a symbol of the importance of compassion, a reminder that every person, no matter how different or frightening they might appear, deserves to be seen, understood, and loved. Ruth Hartwell had given him that gift in life, and now, through the careful work of historians and archivists, he would continue to receive it in death. The boy with the unsettling gaze had finally found peace, not just in his grave behind the Kansas barn, but in the Kuspoin Sopotali, understanding and acceptance that had taken nearly a century to fully realize. In the end, the photograph's truth was both simple and profound. Sometimes what feels wrong is only what we have yet to understand, and sometimes the greatest mysteries are solved, not through investigation or analysis, but through the willingness to approach the unknown with an open heart and the courage to love without condition. Thank you for joining us today on Holloway Archives. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share it with others who appreciate these forgotten tales of human resilience and compassion. Let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts who understand that the most important discoveries aren't always about solving puzzles, but about understanding the depth and complexity of the human heart. Until next time, remember that every photograph tells a story, and sometimes those stories can change the way we see the world around us.